Now, I think the argument you make that a minority religion, particularly where there is skin colour involved also, that does raise sensitivities which the established religion, if you like, it's different. But something which has been remarked upon fairly often, and I've taken an interest in myself, is the way, for instance, that the BBC has reported, or very often not reported, the persecution of Christians around the world. It was particularly noticeable at the time of when the Rohingya persecution in Myanmar was in the headlines, but there have been reports which have said quite clearly that if you play the numbers game, the most persecuted religion in the world is Christianity, and the BBC seems to be very reluctant to.
I think it's complicated. Look, I would say that let's take two examples. I think that the coverage of the tribulations persecution of Christians in Israel, Palestine, which a number of people, including the Archbishop of Canterbury, have regularly drawn attention to, as has the Catholic Church in this country, has probably been underreported. Mm-hmm. I thought generally that the appalling persecution of minorities in Iraq and Syria who were Christian by IS in that war was quite well reported, and I think that one of the problems you have in reporting is that quite often it's very possible to get stuck in a rut, and in Israel Palestine the fundamental narrative, very simple narrative of two peoples. Jewish people and generically Arabs, with a broad assumption most of them are Muslims, is such a kind of controlling narrative, and it's been repeated in stories, and there's the kind of underlying assumption for stories that a kind of nuanced story within that is the fact that there was once, hardly exists anymore, a very significant minority of Arabs, Palestinians living in Israel, Palestine, who were members of an ancient Christian tradition or multiple Christian traditions. It's in the broader way that these stories typically, it's incredibly hard to get enough historical and geographical context in to really make sense of what's going on. Mm-hmm. History, geography, and conflicts are both historical and geographical. So I think that the record is probably, I say this now just as a like you, a viewer and a listener, is spotty. Generally, as I said to you earlier, I think that generally, from a very low base, when I arrived at the BBC, I mean, as in basically a complete lack of interest and knowledge, things have got somewhat better, and that painful stories like the Satanic Verses and the rest of it began to over years to sensitize editors and journalists to the idea that this stuff is potentially explosive and certainly frequently newsworthy. And the thing about religion is it produces lots of honestly very good stories, and we should, as journalists, we should be pursuing the good stories.
And one story which was certainly covered with some relish, I think, was the clerical abuse story as it surfaced initially in Ireland. Yeah. And I did think that there was a kind of almost, it seemed to me at times, an almost unholy glee in the way that that was covered.
Maybe. I want to say that the journalists who uncovered it in America, in Ireland, in the UK and elsewhere have done the Catholic Church and other churches a big favour. May not feel like that, but I think it's vanishingly unlikely that the churches would have, without the reporting, begun to put their house in order. And I think it's an example, I'm afraid, in the sense that, you know, I think it's an example of overall of great journalism. And if you say it was done with enthusiasm, I mean, that may be the case, but it was, I think, I'm afraid, fully legitimate. I mean,
absolutely. No, there could be no doubt about that. I mean, the point is that the stables needed cleansing.
Yeah, that's right. And I have to say,
and without journalism, how would that have been done? That's true.
I think, of course, you know, a sort of kind of glee about such a horrible set of stories is not appropriate. But honestly, the churches should be, you know, I mean, you know, round the corner in the cathedral and elsewhere, we should be getting down on our knees and thanking God for providing some great investigative journalists to uncover something which otherwise, and which obviously, to state the absolutely obvious, didn't just reveal the presence of a really quite astonishing number of paedophiles. I mean, if you work out, particularly in some of the US dioceses, the percentage of priests in the Boston diocese, the Philadelphia diocese, and one or two other dioceses, and these dioceses were still. I mean, the work is far from over. This is the terrifying thing. It's still the kind of legal work now to figure out how extensive it was is still ongoing. It also revealed profound governance issues.
Mm-hmm. What sort of percentages do you think there were?
Well, we're talking. It's very hard to know, but the range in some of these American dioceses might have been 3, 5, 6, 7% of the priesthood, and you know that no chief executive could survive if it turned out that 7% of your employees were fraudsters and who were defrauding the country. You'd be fired on the spot. I mean, it's like it's unimaginable. I mean, that would be, you know, for any CEO, public company, private company, would be the sense of loss of control. And the other obvious question for the church is not fully answered yet: is if 3, 4, 5% of your fellow priests are paedophiles, where were the whistleblowers? How many more either knew or suspected? It won't be zero. And you can very quickly get to numbers when you think about the people who knew and said nothing. I'm not just talking about the hierarchy, but so I mean this is a calamity in the life of the church. Possibly the worst calamity that has ever hit the church, and it's entirely self-inflicted. So in the end, although I know what you mean about glee, that's not the right emotion. No. I think thorough coverage of this story and ongoing coverage of the story, I'm afraid, is probably the right thing journalistically, but also morally.
If there's one thing we've learned over the past 30 years or so, I think certainly when I was, in the 1970s and 80s, I was not aware, as I think many of us were unaware, of this idea of paedophilia and the idea of the sexual abuse of children within institutions. One thing we have learned over the past 30 years is that paedophiles will go to those places where they will have access. And of course that was the situation exactly with Jimmy Savile at the BBC.
Completely, yeah. I mean, and it's very clear. Child abuse is not limited to the either the Christian churches or the other great religions of the world. Many other institutions turned out, and the business of being blasé about these things, and underestimating the risks. That's got to be, that's a much more widespread thing. I think that's very fairly said.
I mean, you raised the point about whistleblowers in the church, and of course, were there whistleblowers at the BBC? I don't know if there were.
Well, so I mean, the short answer is my reading of the inquiries into the Savile thing suggest that. I mean, there was a complete scan, as I understand it, of the archive, and I think it's fair to say, and I haven't read every page of the main Smith report, but I read the summary. There's no documentary evidence.
No.
There's no documentary evidence, and something doesn't exist in the BBC record, which frankly does exist in most of the dioceses, which is extensive paperwork. I mean, there is an absolute paper trail of complaints and so forth about individual priests when they were assigned to other parishes. You know all the stories. That doesn't exist at the BBC. If you say, but there must have been people close to Jimmy Savile who suspected or knew and could have done something. I mean, we don't know that, and the inquiries didn't find that. Some were prepared to admit to that or whatever, but it seems hard to believe that there weren't people. But I think your point about naivety is well taken. When I joined the BBC, my story, by the way, is essentially I think of Jimmy Savile as someone from my childhood on the television. And although he was still brought, I mean, I think Jim Will Fix It carried on into the 1980s or something. I never worked with him or met him. I didn't know he was working for the BBC, honestly. I mean, he had one programme when I was Director General, I didn't know that. One thing I do know, though, is very early on, I started at the BBC in 79, and 1980 or 81, I think I can't remember whether it was for a cousin or for my sister, I tried to get some people tickets to be in the audience for Top of the Pops. And one thing I was told is they had to have passports. And it's so interesting. And it basically checked their ages. And at the time, I thought, well, that's actually rather prudent. That they want young people so they don't get underage people. I'm a journalist. I never thought, why
make the connection?
Why does this one programme insist on young people bringing passports? So there's something there, but it's complicated. There was child abuse at Stonyhurst. I remember, I think this was much later, probably early 90s. So I've been working with the BBC already for well over a decade. Hearing that there'd been some arrests at the school, and thinking, in the way you do, well, God, how disgraceful and how disappointing! It would never have happened in my time. Then it turned out the arrests were actually to do with incidents which had happened in my time, and I don't want to say, and involving a relatively small number of individuals, but by the way, many of whom were acquitted. Though there were some convictions as well. Well, for what it's worth, I scratched my head and thought about it. And although you've got to be careful with this stuff, I think I knew. And we didn't have words like paedophilia, but I think I knew there were some kids who were very close to teachers and used to kind of favoritism. They'd get help with their homework. They'd go and see the teacher in the evening. I think I knew. I didn't do that. I could have. I think I knew which teachers. It's what's interesting is that I knew without ever having any words or even vocalising it. So it is interesting. So it's
it is. It's. I mean, I was educated by the Christian Brothers, and there was one brother.
That explains a lot, by the way.
Yes. Well, I too didn't like to be beaten, but was.
That's the armed. It's the armed wing of the Jesuits, really.
But there was one brother in particular who we used to joke about it, you know, and of course, like you, looking back, I think we knew, but he had moved on. Actually, I didn't have much. I didn't overlap much with him, but certainly it was kind of known. And I think that's...
But the other thing, which is, I think people... And this is the terrible thing about it, is that young... You know, by the time... If you're at one of these schools, and the same would probably be true if you were practically in care, you know, in a care home or whatever, you'd... By the time you're 14, you think you're a soldier. I mean, you think you're good at survival, you can read people, you can keep your nose clean, keep out of trouble. And in a way, that's one of the things which I think means things like whistleblowing by a child, certainly, in these institutions, is very difficult.
Very difficult.
Because in a way, it will be such an admission of loss of control. And
yes.
You're trying to be... You're killing yourself to be self-reliant and...
Yes.
Absolutely. Not to cry, not to, there's a whole culture of survival and sort of, yes. And all the rest of it. And
it toughened you up.
Sort of thing. Sure. Well, that's right. And
it's very true.
And of course, we know now that it was often more vulnerable kids, more homesick kids who were the ones who were preyed upon. So it's a dark, it is a very dark story.
So let me ask you this: here you are. You rose to the top in the BBC. Eventually, you went to Channel 4, but where you were controller there, and then Director General at the BBC. Yeah. You're also a believing Catholic. To what extent do your Catholic beliefs play into the decisions that you make day to day? You've already discussed the one about Jerry Springer, the opera.
Yeah.
So that was clearly something which touched on a specifically religious idea.
Yeah.
But day to day, how did your Catholic consciousness, your Catholic conscience play into the decisions you made about programs or whatever?
I think it's important to say that in the role of editor-in-chief is what we're talking about, really here, which I was at both Channel 4 and the BBC, but interestingly enough, not at the New York Times. I was chief executive. As editor-in-chief, you have responsibilities which go well beyond personal preference and, as it were, personal belief system. You're trying to be an editor, I mean, on behalf of 65 million people in this country and hundreds of millions of people around the world, of kind of, as it were, all faiths and none and all of that. And it seems to me you're not doing the job properly or morally if any part of that is, as it were, trying to preference your take on religious questions and the rest of it over the commitment to an impartial presentation of the truth, a commitment to broad expression of diversity of opinion, and all the rest of it. And that's important to say. I think it's reasonable to bring, and indeed that you have to bring, broad values to bear, and, you know, at least in my version of Catholic and Christian morality, the fundamental values I regard as universal ones. And so I never felt there was a conflict in saying we're going to try and do the right thing, and what matters, the truth matters, telling the truth, fairness matters, sensitivity and humanity to other human beings, and the depiction of pain, suffering, death, human dignity matters, and so on. I think you need to universalise those values when you think about editorial decisions. And you can frequently end up deciding you're going to do something which would not be your private citizen choice, probably. In 2010, I decided that it was appropriate to put Nick Griffin, the head of the British National Party, on Question Time. Many people regarded that as an almost evil thing to do. I thought that, given the democratic status of that programme, and given the fact that the British National Party, whatever one thought of them, it's not a party whose values I support. But given that their success in local elections and the recent Euro elections, as was then, they had done electorally everything a minority party would have to do to get a seat, at least once on Question Time. So I decided we should do that in the name of, in a sense, democracy and the right of the public to decide, not me, but the public to decide whether or not they how they reacted to Nick Griffin's views.
But the objection to that might be that you had sort of franchised out your conscience, as it were, to the BBC's internal culture, if you will. That you went along with the. So I don't know if you'd agree, but I think that there is I think all institutions, from the post office to the BBC and everything in between,
yeah.
Every organisation has an internal culture, and in the BBC's case, it is a liberal, secularised sort of culture.
In that instance, I don't know this for a fact, but certainly before that programme, the Question Time Nick Griffin was broadcast, I would say, I would guess that 80 or 90% of the people in the BBC thought it was the wrong decision.
I'm sure they did.
Was against the BBC's culture.
Mm.
So, in other words, I would say that with questions like that, I couldn't give a fig about the BBC's culture.
No.
That wasn't the issue. I mean, and there were several others. I mean, I decided, and all of these decisions, by the way, these are, the way it works at the BBC is I'm ratifying a decision taken lower down the system in this case, or I can challenge and reverse it. I mean, it's like a Supreme Court. I can either, in this case, the Question Time team and the Director of News, on balance, thought we should do it. I thought they were right, so we did it. There was another famous occasion where the DEC, the Disaster Emergency Committee, wanted to put out an emergency appeal for the people of Gaza. There'd been one of these periods of both action on the ground and air attacks, rockets from Gaza, Israeli missiles and bombing and so forth of Gaza. And I decided on the grounds of impartiality that we should not broadcast that DEC. My successor, Tony Hall, took the opposite decision on essentially the same topic a few years later. But in my view, in the end, it was going to be impossible to do that without appearing to show some partiality for one side in a very controversial dispute. So I thought it broke the BBC's impartiality. So I would say that whether it's my as it were, natural obstinacy as an individual, but I think I would say that if you look back at my time as editor-in-chief, I wasn't afraid to do things which did not accord with what I would describe as the natural majority cultural decision of the BBC.
No, I wasn't really making that allegation against you, really, because I know that to have been the case. But this notion of impartiality, I wonder if it has not become slightly threadbare. That, for instance, if one take the abortion debate, for instance.
Yes.
It is my belief, and I've done some research into it over the years, the BBC is not impartial in that debate. I think that there was a very good example just on the Today programme 10 days ago when this sad instance of the woman who had used the abortifacient late in term pregnancy to abort her child in the 36th week or something.
Yeah, and then went to jail.
Yeah. There was a discussion on the Today programme where there was no representation or any attempt at representing through questions the moral perspective, if you like, from a Catholic perspective, a Christian perspective, one might say, on that issue. I mean, I just don't think the BBC gets it right on that.
Well, look, the impartiality sounds like such a simple idea. It's a complicated thing, and I think we have to accept, firstly, that most people who talk about wanting more impartiality normally have in mind, and by the way, they've got every right to do this, a particular issue or a set of issues they support which they think aren't getting enough airtime. So actually the impartiality argument is largely conducted by people who probably would be happiest if their view not just got equal time, got most of the time.
Yeah.
So it's a sort of battleground, and most people who even talk about freedom of speech, I mean, most of the people who thought Gary Lineker was right to attack Suella Braverman's policies on the boats and his absolute passionate right to say so. If Gary had actually put on Twitter, God bless Suella Braverman, at last we've got a Home Secretary who's going to finally stop these people coming into our country, they would have said the BBC should have stopped him doing it.
He'd have been out the door, I think.
Well, so the point is, by and large, where people stand on this issue depends on, very much depends on where they sit. I have to say, I don't, because I live mainly in the United States of America, I cannot speak to the BBC's, routine coverage of abortion right now because I don't cover that story. But of course, there are sets of issues where they are moral questions like abortion, ultimately, where with two conflicting principles, each of which you can argue exactly as I said. They're as Alistair McIntyre says, and he gives abortion as an example. You can go back to first principles, both from Christian Catholic teaching on abortion or from fundamental liberal principles about the right of the individual, as it were, to make decisions about themselves, and you can get to the same position. They are fiendishly difficult to do in anything short of a kind of stopwatch time debate where each side get 30 minutes. And I would say you get those. You get things like climate change, where there's a sliding scale of scientific consensus, but still a lot of popular skepticism, and also a fairly hardcore, as it were, group of skeptics and deniers who are extremely good at winning tactical points on impartiality when they make complaints about particular items and the rest of them. Good at playing the BBC's own internal complaints process like a violin. So all of this is playing at the time. Look, I think when I was editor-in-chief, context is everything, and oddly enough, one of the things that I felt most passionately about as an editor at the time at the BBC was fighting for enough literal time, so in the 9 o'clock news or the 6 o'clock news on the radio, and a willingness not to cover 5 small stories, so you can do a small number of important stories with enough time that you can add context. And unfortunately, the poor woman you describe, and I'm not even sure whether it's right or wrong or patronising to say it, but the woman you talk about who she sparked a number of interesting and difficult questions. And actually, my sense of the coverage is by the time the issue about whether a jail sentence, I understand the judge gave a part suspended or part already served or whatever it was, and part she actually was going to have to go to jail for some months or a year or whatever. But the debate about whether that was appropriate essentially took all the available time. I mean, this is, it's a fairly lively news cycle at the moment with fun and games in UK politics, Ukraine war and all the rest of it. And it's like they did one topic, and the topic was it appropriate to send her to jail or not? And oddly enough, I think you could be against abortion in principle and still come down on either side, given the particular circumstances, whether the humane and appropriate thing was to send her to jail or not. It's almost because it's a kind of separate issue, and that was the issue that, rightly or wrongly, the editors of the Today programme, I didn't hear the Today programme, but the coverage seemed to go to that. Was the judge right? And the kind of politicians weighed in and were off to the races. But broadly, if you say that often very complicated subjects get mangled, or that there are occasions where traditional moral or religious perspectives on topics get undercovered or insufficient airtime, I'm sure that's true. In the same way that sometimes, I think with justice, kind of people who've got more radical and countercultural perspectives often argue they get squeezed out as well. Yes. I mean, I think the question of whether or not, as you've argued, that there's almost like a semi-deliberate or at least a very strong cultural bias to exclude traditional perspectives. I'm more sceptical about that than you are, and I don't want to deny it completely, because you can see how worldviews and the average worldview. I mean, the BBC is largely populated with people from they tend to live in cities, not in small towns or the countryside. Often the kind of frontline commanders, God help us, are sort of like 28. I was I think 29 or 30 when I was editing the 9 o'clock news. It was like they're essentially, they now look to us like children. They're children, which means nowadays they're appalling millennials, and they're the young people of today, in quotes. All of that. So there's also a generational thing which plays very strongly into this, and culture wars between generations is itself rather underreported. A lot of this is to do with the kind of crankiness which afflicts people like you and me at our age, where we sort of see decline everywhere, and cherished values being trashed by terrible young people. I'm naughty because I often find myself agreeing with the young people rather than the old people. I'm a kind of traitor to my generation, but
do you reject outright the idea that the BBC has a worldview, a particular? If you
was my mother right, basically?
Yeah, basically, was your mother right?
I'm not going to say my mother was ever wrong. I think the truth is more complicated, and the BBC itself, of course, is it is in many ways an astonishingly traditional organisation. And this is the complicated thing, and it knows it is. And its relationship with the Church of England is a deep relationship and a very traditional relationship. You know, I'd be taken out to dinner, quite a nice dinner at the Athenaeum, to be beaten up by a group of Anglican bishops, you know, every other year, sort of thing. But you know, the BBC is not. It might like to think it's very countercultural. It's far less. It's far more a consenting part of an establishment with functional respect for and. You know, you have to look at the coverage of the days after the death of Her Majesty the Queen and the funeral, the obsequies and the coronation. That and Songs of Praise and the Archers and the Antiques Roadshow, that's the BBC too. Mm-hmm.
Yes,
and Birdsong on Radio 4. I mean, it's not all cappuccinos and trans issues. I mean, and that's part of the rich tapestry too. But it's, you know, I mean, it's still got that absolute dyed-in-the-wool, rather splendid traditional quality, and it's still absolutely alive. And you know, it's not as besieged in the BBC. I mean, you know, the protests inside the BBC at 10 days of official mourning, I didn't hear a squeak.
No. So, do you think that, suppose you had not been a Catholic, suppose you had not been a believer, what would have been different at the BBC in your time, do you think?
Well, that's very interesting. Supposing I hadn't been myself, I find it quite difficult.
No, but what I mean is, can you look back and say that because I am who I am, I did that job in a way which would not have been done in the same way by someone who was not a Christian?
I want to say that what I tried to do was bring clarity and consistency to the application of a set of values, which, you know, of which the truth will set you free. Mm-hmm. To quote St. John, or rather to quote Jesus Christ, would be a central one, which is the truth matters more than almost anything, and is, in the broader sense, an empowering and liberating thing, to apply that pretty, as far as I could, without fear or favour. Yes. And when it was popular and when it wasn't popular. Now, I can't tell you whether some of the most impressive, morally clear and consistent people I know are not believers or are passionate believers in other religions. So I don't want to say, you know, without my unique brand of religion or without a religion of any kind, people can't do that. But I certainly, in my case, associate the attempt, never of course totally successful, to apply and to be consistent about the way you apply values, I do associate with my upbringing from my parents and my upbringing from my religious teachers as that's what we have to do.
We have lived, I'm an older man than you, but we have lived through a period of very rapid change, both in wider society, but in the church also. When you look at the Catholic Church now as a Catholic, do you feel a sense of dismay, a sense of defeat, a sense of we have lost ground, or do you, as you were talking about, the clerical abuse scandal at least gives us the opportunity to start from somewhere and begin to clean up the act. I mean, are you an optimist or a pessimist?
Well, I mean, look, I mean, I mean, it's a fairly obvious kind of fundamental kind of element of Christian belief that we need to be saved. If we didn't need to be saved, what's the point? So we need to be saved. The Catholic Church needs to be saved. You know, the Catholic Church is always falling down and always needs to be saved. And right now it's falling down and needs to be saved. And a spirit of renewal and revival and reflection and rebuilding, which has been needed through the entire history of the, you know, literally back to the apostles running away after the crucifixion. That's what it's always been like and is like now. And I'm absolutely not someone who thinks that a church with half the pews empty means the end, or that this is about ratings in some way, that this is a sort of, that we've got a declining analog channel, you know. I don't think that at all. I think that the process of renewal is continuous. But if you say, do we need it now? We do. But I meet leaders of the church sometimes, not often, but I meet leaders of the church who give me great confidence that that's possible.
You not only have had a stellar career in terms of your professional life, you're also a father and a family man. Do you see that for your children? Do you think that the church can play the same role as it did for you when you were a young man?
I think it's complicated. My eldest son, yes. The other two, no. I mean, it's all three of them, I would say, take religion seriously and respectfully. But in terms of, as it were, church-going, practicing Catholics, I'm 1 for 3 at the moment, or as it were. So, but the what I accept is that the upbringing I had, and maybe the upbringing you had as well, is rarer, certainly in Western countries, than it used to be. May become rarer still. I mean, that may be that suffusion in the faith, and it may be that there are other ways that people will come to religion and to God, but the Holy Spirit plays a long game. You know, it's sometimes a rather mysterious game, but so I mean, maybe the Spirit's tactics will change. I mean, it's. But I think the idea that the whole thing depends on a particular moment and a particular... You can kind of venerate a tradition and a sort of upbringing. I rather do, but the idea that's the only way, that's not what the history of the church tells us, that there's one pathway. There's only one pathway, and if you don't catch a child early, and it won't happen. I think we need to just be more open to, what renewal will look like.
Yeah, so I don't think anyone. I mean, my own daughters are not churchgoers, but I think they do respect religion. I think any parent, this is you cannot expect necessarily that your children will just naturally inherit your own religious beliefs. I mean, that's just not realistic, so
Yeah.
you have to accept, painful though it is sometimes.
And that's right. I have to say, when, as a child, I never really felt I had a choice.
No, me neither. Me neither. And perhaps that's the difference.
Oh, I don't know. It's very difficult to tell. I mean, and I'm, as it happens, I've got a fairly adventurous and also rather contrarian mind. I'm not an obvious candidate for, kind of robotics sort of. I mean, you'd have thought I'd be a rather bad prospect in terms of. I mean, I'm argue about everything, and it's odd that there's this one central thing which it's turned out to be something which I just basically got right from the start and just never really questioned deeply. That's, but I think people find their way. I mean, I think isn't that what we learn, which is people can and although it's not my experience that people in the middle of their lives suddenly finding something which makes sense or two things which click and make sense, that's often been the experience through history as well.
For parents, maybe it's a question of, for both of us, maybe it's a question of show don't tell. That
yes, it's a bit troubling, isn't it? Really?
Yeah. Now I think about it, but the point about giving, if you can, good moral example is, of course, the key to it, isn't it, surely?
Yes. I mean, we've all got to be careful about. I mean, I think there's one of the many jibes we get from the Son of God is loving your children and bringing them up properly. Even the pagans do that. I mean, in other words, there's something more. There's something more that he wants from us, and it's quite hard to put your finger on what it is. But I mean, I feel a lack of it. It's like what. There's some bigger giving of yourself, and there's something more asked for us than we, or at least I, generally give. I fear that I'm a good pagan, but possibly not that much more than that.
Finally, I just want to ask you about this honour which has been bestowed on you now. So you're a Knight of the Realm now, and you began talking at the beginning of this interview about the fact that your mother being Irish, but also having this scepticism about England and Englishness. This puts a seal on you as establishment man, doesn't it? But do you feel that Catholics are in this English society, in any sense, a sort of separate breed, a breed apart?
I think it's that itself is another hour, as it were. I mean, in other words, I think that the notion that it's possible, which obviously runs very deep in what it is to be an English Catholic, that it's possible to be both a loyal Catholic and a loyal British man or woman, or indeed any gender. That's a topic which almost to this day is questioned. At my school, Stonyhurst, we have plus or minus 20 martyrs and a few saints. The school is abroad until the 18th century, then comes and settles at Stonyhurst in Lancashire. And there's a toast which is to it's to the Pope and the Duke of Lancaster, meaning the British monarch, who, of course, more importantly than monarch is Duke of Lancaster. And the toast is saying, we can do both. We can do both. But there are people who doubt it, and as you know, there's a thread of who do they really support? Which I think you can detect in the Brexit vote to some extent.
Interesting.
You probably know that with the religious split on Brexit, it's quite striking. I mean, Catholics, even look at the Catholic demographics by age and also because of a large number of working class Catholics. You look at the demographics, you'd say it would have been a Leave vote. Actually, it was very marginally in favour of remaining. Members of the Church of England, 60-40 for Leave. And there's some thread of the Reformation and the sense of Rome and divided loyalties and this foreign power, which is still there. So I think it's a good question to ask, but I have to say, I live mainly in the United States, where being British is enough for most Americans to handle, rather than these niceties sort of thing. I'm as a former director general of the BBC, you are ex officio a member of the British establishment. So this honour, which I feel very proud to have received, I think it possibly puts the icing on the cake, but there was a big cake eaten before it arrived.
I was struck, someone mentioned to me the other day, just apropos of what we're talking about, how they were struck in the coronation at the quite explicit Protestant nature of the oaths taken. Yeah. That was striking, wasn't it, in a way, if you're attuned to listen out for these indicators, because this still is a Protestant nation.
And it's not so long ago. When I was at Stonyhurst last year, they showed me they have some relics from some of the martyrs, these are old boys, and you see a skull with a jagged hole in the top because the skull's been put on a spike, and a coccyx which has been sheared. There's a diagonal shear in it, which is from quartering. This is not ancient history, and of course we live safely and happily and are allowed to worship in the way we want to in this country. But this is not the continuity between the early modern period and the present day. And as you know, the last anti-Catholic piece of legislation, which was the prohibition on Catholics and the monarchy, members of the monarchy and the rest of it, David Cameron is the Prime Minister when that was taken off the statute book. 2013, I think, is the last removal. And of course, obviously, one understands the reasons why it's part of the coronation. I'm not really against it. And there was the Cardinal participated in the coronation and so forth. But, you shouldn't forget your history. And there's no danger of that at Stonyhurst anyway.
Sir Mark Thompson, thank you very much indeed. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Robin.
If you've enjoyed watching this interview, and I hope you have, and you'd like to see more of this kind of work, you might care to consider making a small donation. If you go to our website, newhumanum.org, and follow the links, you'll find a donation page. Anything you can give us would be gratefully received.